And you are live.
When you're ready, Beth.
Okay, we're going to continue our walkthrough of the strike all amendment to H 454. We're on page 20, line 15, section 3. And I should have started by saying that after the intent section, the findings, and the commission, you'll see reader assistance headings, and they represent three kind of concepts that everything underneath those section headings represents. And so the first topic is scale, and each of those broad topics comes with a small intent section to start it. So the intent section for the scale is section 3. It is the intent of the General Assembly to transform education in Vermont by leveraging attainable and research-based scale to increase equity of opportunity and promote efficiency and affordability. And that would take effect on July 1, 2025. Section 4 are amendments to Section 165 in Title 16, which is the Education Quality Standards Statute. These changes to this section would take effect July 1, 2026, and this is the class size minimum section for public schools. So, education quality standards. In order to carry out Vermont's policy, I'm on page 21. This is all current law, that Vermont's children will be afforded educational opportunities that are substantially equal in quality. Each public school, including each CTE center, shall meet the following education quality standards. And then there's a whole host of things they need to follow. And then even some of that is spelled out even more deeply and intricately in state board rule. But adding what this amendment does is it adds a brand new subdivision here for class size minimums. So again, page 21, line 7, the school complies with average class size minimum standards, provided, however, that when class size minimum standards apply to content areas, an individual class may be smaller than the minimum average. As used in the subdivision, content area means a group of courses within a specific licensing endorsement area. That will make sense, hopefully, as we walk through what the actual standards are. So class size standards. The average class size minimum for kindergarten classes shall be 12 students. The average class size minimum for grades 1 through 4 shall be 15 students. And the average class size minimum for grades 5 through 12 in all required content areas shall be 18 students. Multi-age classrooms for grades K through 8 shall be limited to 2 grade levels per classroom. On page 22 now. CTE, flexible pathways, terminal courses, advanced placement courses, courses that require specialized equipment, and driver's education classes shall be excluded from the class size minimum requirements. Small group services for the purposes of providing special education, supplemental or targeted academic intervention, or English learner instruction shall also be excluded from class size minimums. And then class sizes are required to, shall not exceed the minimum occupancy limits established by local and state fire codes. If a school board determines that it operates a school that is unable to comply with the class size minimum standards due to geographic isolation, or if the school has developed an implementation plan to meet the standards, eventually, and that plan may include consolidation or merger, the school board may ask the State Board of Education to grant it a waiver. The state board is required to define what qualifies as geographic isolation in its rules, in its education quality standards rules, and then the state board's decision regarding waivers is final. If the secretary determines that a school is not meeting the class size minimum standards over the course of 2 consecutive school years, the secretary shall recommend to the state board, I'm on page 23, one or more of the actions listed in subsection B of this section, regardless of whether the school is meeting all other education quality standards, and then the state board is required to follow the procedure for subsection C. So what is B and C? B is the process that already happens for public schools. You'll see this is all current law. If a public school is not meeting education quality standards. So what we're saying here is if a school is not meeting minimum class size requirements and they have not obtained a waiver, then the process for non-compliance with education quality standards for any other education quality standards is going to apply. And that process is that every year, the secretary is required to determine if students are being provided substantially equal educational opportunities. And if the secretary determines that a school is not meeting EQS, or that the school is making insufficient progress in improving student performance, then the secretary has to describe to that school or the school board what that school needs to do in order to meet those standards and provide it technical assistance. And then if the school fails to meet the standards or make sufficient progress within 2 years of that determination by the secretary, then the secretary has to make one of the following recommendations to the state board. The recommendation could be that the agency continue to work with the school. It could be that the state board adjust SU boundaries or responsibilities for the superintendent. I'm on page 24. It could be the secretary assume administrative control over an individual school. It could be that the state board close an individual school, or it could be that the state board require 2 or more school districts to consolidate. And then subsection C is a requirement for a hearing and a requirement that the action ordered by the state board must be the least intrusive, consistent with the need to provide substantially equal educational opportunities. And then if a school board is aggrieved by this decision, it can appeal to the courts. So if the school fails to meet class size minimum requirements, that process would apply. And that is the education quality standard section, the class size minimum section.
Representative Kimball.
Thank you, Representative Canfield. Just a couple of questions, Beth. The term average minimum seems to be a term of art. One's an average, one's a minimum. So I'm just hoping, does that have a basis somewhere that we can look at?
No, I believe what is meant here is that the class size minimum is 12 students, but that can be averaged amongst all of the kindergarten grades. So if you have 6 kindergarten classes, the average number of students in each class would need to be 12.
So within
So there could be
school or within a school district?
Within a school.
Okay. And then the other question I had was, I think you said one of the powers of the state board was to adjust supervisory unions in terms of somebody not meeting the quality standards. Yeah. If in this concept, should that also read or school districts?
That's the last option. The state board could require school districts to consolidate governance structures. Or the state board could require.
So in the concept from the governor, it was to eliminate supervisory unions. So this is maintaining.
You haven't eliminated supervisory unions yet.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Brannigan.
Thank you, Representative Canfield. Can you hear me now, Bill?
Yes.
Okay. Beth, my question has to do with standard ways and means tasks here. Our job is going to be to make sure there's enough money to pay for all these teachers. So is there data right now around, because I'm assuming right now schools across Vermont basically fit this description of minimum. So is there any data that shows how much we're spending per class or per district or anything like that that we can use as a springboard to make sure that in our plan for providing money to get this whole shebang up and running, to make sure there's enough money to do it? Is there data existing right now, or should we plan on going out and gathering it ourselves?
I think that would be a good question for the field, for the agency. I don't know if there is data related to each school operated in the state and their minimum class sizes. I don't know if that exists.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Beth.
All right, we're going to move on to Section 5. What happened? Failure to comply with education quality standards. This is a bit of session law to go to complement what we just walked through. It would also take effect on July 1, 2026, and it states that notwithstanding 16 VSA 165B 4 and 5, which are the penultimate and ultimate options available to the State Board of Education if a school is not meeting education quality standards, and any other provision of law to the contrary, the State Board shall be prohibited from ordering school district consolidation or school consolidation if a school fails to comply with class size minimum education quality standards, and the resulting consolidation would result in school construction costs in excess of the applicable district's capital reserve account until the General Assembly establishes new school district boundaries and takes further action regarding the consequences for failure to meet education quality standards. So if schools were not meeting education quality standards regarding class size minimums, and the State Board wanted to just consolidate school districts or schools, but in order to make that work, you'd have to build a wing onto a school and therefore go out to bond for construction costs. This section is saying the State Board can't order that type of consolidation until the General Assembly creates new district boundaries and takes further action regarding what consequences are appropriate for the State Board to order for failure to meet education quality standards in a future state. All right, I'm going to keep scrolling. We're on page 26 now, section 6. Remember, we're still in the scale bucket, if you will. This section is asking, this section itself would have a July 1, 2025 effective date, but then within this section itself, there are different deliverable dates. So this section is asking the State Board to initiate rulemaking to amend the education quality standards rules on or before July 1, 2026, or I'm sorry, on or before August 1, 2026, to ensure compliance with class size minimum standards. So update the rules to make sure they match the statute, they don't conflict. And then on or before July 1, 2027, to adopt standards for statewide proficiency-based graduation requirements based on standards adopted by the State Board and recommendations from the Agency of Education. So those are updates to the education quality standards. Two separate sets of updates. And then on line 11, page 26, this section is asking the State Board on or before August 1st, 2026 to initiate rulemaking to update the independent school rule series, the 2200 school series, to require independent schools that accept public tuition comply with class size minimums pursuant to an amendment that we're going to walk through later on in this bill. And it also requires the State Board to create a process, a review process for failure to meet class size minimum requirements and the corresponding actions the board may take for such noncompliance. But the board has to provide an approved independent school a substantially similar opportunity to come into compliance as it would give to a public school. So the process in the education quality standards statute for a public school not to meet education quality standards is not 100% applicable to independent schools. And so this is saying, state board, you've got to come up with a review process for independent schools that fail to meet this requirement. And you have to provide them with a substantially similar opportunity to come into compliance as you would a public school. And then the state board is, just to finish up this section, on page 27, line 3, the state board is required to come back to you all with a report in December 1 of this year with proposed standards for schools to be deemed small by necessity. And that is the end of section 6.
Representative Burkhart.
Yeah, this might actually be a question more for Peter. I just wanted to raise it to see if anyone else had it and sort of get it on the record, which is I was kind of surprised with how few additions to the standards we're requiring. And this goes to Ways and Means work, because if we are putting more money into districts that have traditionally chosen not to spend that money or not to use the tax capacity they've been given in the past, I'm just a little bit concerned if the only 2 new standards really are graduation standards, which kind of come at the very end of the process, and class size minimum standards. So I was kind of surprised there wasn't a little bit more guidance about how additional funding would need to be applied. So just putting it out there, it's probably more a question for Peter or the Ed committee the next time we talk to them.
And you'll be sure to ask it. Representative Holcomb.
Hi, thank you very much. So in section B, this says that they propose standards for schools to be deemed small by necessity. And the preceding section is referring to independent schools. Does that small by necessity apply to both public schools and independent schools?
That's a great question, and I don't believe this language differentiates.
I'm sorry, when you say it doesn't differentiate, does the default mean it applies to both or just to one?
I think the default means it's ambiguous, and therefore it would depend on who you're talking to. And so I think that would be a question for the Education Committee on what their intent was here.
Thank you.
Representative Odie.
Thank you. I'm concerned about the language in section 6(2), and it says, honored for January 2027, the State Board of Education shall initiate rulemaking to amend the approved Independent School Rule 2200 series, etc., pursuant to 3 VSA Chapter 25. And here it is. To require approved independent schools that intend to accept public tuition to comply with the class size minimum standards set pursuant to 16 VSA, etc. What I read that, it sounds like if you're already accepting public tuition, you don't have to comply. But if you intend to accept it in the future, you're not yet an independent school, that you don't have to comply.
I can see how you could certainly, how that would be a reasonable reading of this on its own. And I think when we walk through the section of law that comes further on in the bill, that requires independent schools to follow the class size minimum standards, it will be clear that it is if they're eligible to receive. It's this language is borrowed from current law and from Act 173, the requirement that if a school intends to accept public tuition, then it has to agree to accept kiddos placed there on an IEP by their IEP team. But I believe that the section of law that we're going to walk through later makes it clear that any school that accepts public funds needs to follow the class size minimum requirements,
Well,
regardless of whether they are currently accepting or want to in the future.
Okay, but all right. Thank you for that explanation. And I just wonder why we couldn't just write to require approved independent schools that accept or that intend to accept.
If you'd like to make that amendment, I'd be happy to work with you on that.
Okay, I will. Thank you.
Okay, Beth.
So we're on page 27, section 7, school size intent. This is intent language. This is not setting any legal standards. It is intent language, and it would take effect July 1, 2025. And it is around school size. So we just talked about class size. Now we're talking about school size. It is the intent of the General Assembly to encourage the efficient use of public funds to modernize school infrastructure to deliver identified 21st century educational goals. And it is further the intent that each public school operating grades 6 through 12 or some subset of those grades shall have a minimum average daily membership of at least 450 students, at least in part by providing a robust state aid for school construction program that is driven by standards for quality for public schools, geographic accessibility, statewide enrollment trends, and capacity and scale that support substantially equal educational opportunities for all Vermont students.
Representative Odie.
Oh, sorry.
All right, then I'm going to move on to section 8.
We have a question from Representative Brannigan.
Thank you. So Beth, I can think of about 5 schools offhand right now who cannot fit 450 people in their building here in northern Franklin County. For schools like that, do they also receive a small by necessity, or whatever that phrase was, a declaration of small by necessity? Or do they have another, so this isn't regarding classroom, this is regarding the entire student membership. But are we talking about a similar exemption for those schools that are very small? And I suppose over in the Northeast Kingdom, there may be counties or sections of counties, Marty could answer this probably, with less than 450 children who have access to the school. I mean, that who live within a region close enough to the school to want to attend there. Did they talk about that, about getting an exemption for small schools like that?
This section is just intent language, and it doesn't create any standards yet. It's aspirational that at some point in the future, we're gonna get to a point, in large, but at least in part, by providing state aid for school construction, to have average daily membership for grades 6 through 12 of at least 450 students in each school. It's just aspirational language.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Beth.
All right, section 8, we're on page 27, line 18, prohibition on school closure and transition to paying tuition. This section would take effect on July 1, 2025, and it is a piece of session law that states, notwithstanding any provision of law to the contrary, a school district shall be prohibited from closing an existing public school and then providing for the education of its resident students by paying tuition for its students to attend a public or approved independent school chosen by the parents of the district's students. So that's our current tuition system. I'm on line 3 of page 28. If a school district that closes an existing public school is unable to provide for the education of its affected resident students in a different school or schools operated by the district, the school district shall provide for the education of its resident students by designating 3 or fewer public schools to serve as the public school or schools of the district in accordance with the process contained in 16 VSA section 827, which is the current law designation process, where a school district would designate 1 or more schools to serve as the public school of that school district. And this is saying you've got to designate another public school to fill that need. Okay, I'm going to move on to section 9. We are on page 28, section 9. The next several pages are going to be school construction. Have you all had a walkthrough of this bill?
No.
No, okay. So the next several sections are from the school construction bill that was introduced this session, and I forget the bill number off the top of my head, but this language is as introduced. So this is the result of the school construction working group from this summer. There was a bill introduced based on their recommendations, and this is the language taken out of that bill and added here. So it starts with a statement of policy that it is the intent of this chapter, and this chapter is the State Aid for School Construction chapter, to encourage the efficient use of public funds to modernize school infrastructure in alignment with current educational needs. School construction projects supported by this chapter should be developed taking consideration of standards of quality for public schools under section 165 of this title. That's the Education Quality Standards section. And prioritizing cost, geographic accessibility, 21st century education facility standards, statewide enrollment trends, and capacity and scale that support best educational practices. Further, it is the intent of this chapter to encourage the use of existing infrastructure to meet the needs of Vermont students. Joint construction projects between 2 or more school districts and consolidation of buildings within a district where feasible and educationally appropriate are encouraged. So this is
H129 or S39. They're both the same. Yep.
Thank you. So this intent section would be, there's chapter 123 would be added to chapter 123 of Title 16, which is our current state aid for school construction chapter. And then section 10 adds section 3442 to chapter 123 in Title 16, which creates the state aid for school construction program. And basically what this section does is it gives the Agency of Education the responsibility for implementing the state aid for school construction program, and then it lays out what all those responsibilities are. So those responsibilities include, I'm on page 29, line 6, reviewing all preliminary applications and issuing an approval or denial of those applications, adopting rules pertaining to school construction and capital outlay, including rules to specify a point prioritization methodology and a bonus incentive structure aligned with the legislative intent that we just walked through. Include as part of its budget submitted to the governor of this its annual school construction funding request. Develop a pre-qualification and review process for project delivery consultants and architecture and engineering firms specializing in pre-K through 12 school design, renovation, or construction, and maintaining a list of such pre-qualified firms and consultants. Providing technical assistance and guidance to school districts and SUs on all phases of school capital projects. I'm on page 30 now. Providing technical assistance and advice, training, and education to school districts, SUs, general contractors, subtractors, construction or project managers, designers, and other vendors in the planning, maintenance, and establishment of school facility space. Maintaining a current list of school construction projects that have received preliminary approval, projects that have received final approval, and the priority of points awarded to each project. Collecting, maintaining, and making publicly available quarterly progress reports on all ongoing school construction projects that shall include at a minimum the cost of the project and the time schedule of the project. Recommending policies and procedures designed to reduce borrowing for school construction programs at both state and local levels. Conducting a needs survey at least every 5 years to ascertain the capital construction, reconstruction, maintenance, and other capital needs for all public schools, and maintaining such data in a publicly accessible format. Developing formal enrollment projection model or using projection models already available. Encouraging school districts and SUs to investigate opportunities for the maximum utilization of space in and around the district or SU. I'm on page 31 now. Collecting and maintaining a clearinghouse of prototypical school plans that may be consulted by eligible applicants. Retaining the services of consultants as necessary to effectuate the roles and responsibilities listed within this section. And give a report to you all annually with the status and implementation of the state aid school construction program, including any data that's required to be collected. So those would be all of the agency's responsibility in a state aid for school construction program. Section 11 on page 31, line 9 creates the state aid for school construction advisory board. This language is going to take effect on July 1, 2025. You'll notice that that's different than the sections above that would take effect. And the thought being that this advisory board may be providing advice to the agency while they are standing up the program that wouldn't take effect until 2026. So let's have them spring to life now. Ultimately, that's a policy choice. So the advisory board, I want to hit on that as hard as I can, that this is an advisory board. Their duties are to advise the agency, I'm on line 13, on the implementation of the state aid for school construction program in accordance with the provisions of this chapter, including the adoption of rules, setting of statewide priorities, criteria for project approval, and recommendation for project approval and prioritization. The agency is responsible for doing all of those things, and the advisory board is responsible for advising the agency. Membership of this advisory board shall be composed of the following 8 members. 4 members who shall serve as ex officio members, which are the state treasurer, commissioner of BGS, executive director of the Vermont Bond Bank or designee, and the chair of the State Board of Education. And I'm on page 32 now. 4 members, none of whom shall be a current member of the General Assembly, who shall serve 4 terms as follows, 4-year terms as follows. 2 members appointed by the Speaker, each of whom shall have expertise in education or construction, real estate or finance, and one of whom shall represent a supervisory union. And 2 members appointed by the Committee on Committees, each of whom shall have expertise in education or construction, real estate or finance, and one of whom shall be an educator. They would serve 4-year terms, and we won't go over the vacancy staggering there. We're going to jump to page 33, line 8. The duties of the advisory board are to advise the agency on the implementation of the state aid for school construction program, including advising on rules, advising on project priorities, propose legislation that the advisory board deems desirable or necessary related to the school construction program, policies and procedures designed to reduce borrowing for school construction programs at both state and local levels, development of formal enrollment projection models or the consideration of using projection models already available. I'm on page 34. Processes and procedures necessary to apply for, receive, administer, and comply with conditions and requirements of any grant, gift, appropriation of property, services, or monies. The clearinghouse of prototypical school plans, the determination of eligible cost components for projects, including partial or full eligibility for project components for which the benefit is shared between the school and other municipal and community entities, development of a long-term vision for statewide capital plan in accordance with the needs and projected funding, collection and maintenance of data on all public school facilities in the state, advising districts on the use of needs survey to ascertain the capital construction, reconstruction, maintenance, and other capital needs for schools across the state, and encouraging school districts and SUs to investigate opportunities to maximize utilization of space in and around the district or supervisory union. So they would be advising AOE on all of those things. And then the state treasurer would call the first meeting to occur, and then they would not meet more than 6 times per year, and they would have the assistance of AOE, and they are eligible for per diem in the usual sense. And then section 12 is a prospective repeal, a sunset that is pretty standard now for creating this type of an advisory board in 10 years, a sunset for July 1, 2035, to force you all to look at it and decide if it's working and if that sunset should be extended. I'm going to keep going. I don't see any hands. Okay, section 13, we're back to a July 1, 2026 effective date. This is language creating the school construction aid special fund. And I understand you all may have some language that's either similar to this or complementary to this. So this would be an area that we would need to square up with work that you all have been contemplating. This section creates the school construction special fund to be administered by AOE for the purposes of awarding aid to school construction projects or grants through the Facilities Master Plan Grant Program that was enacted last year to help school districts get up and running with their facilities master planning. And then funding administrative costs for the construction aid program and awarding emergency aid. And the funds would consist of any amount transferred by the General Assembly and any interest earned by the fund. And that's it for right now for this language. Section 14, again, effective date of July 1, 2026. All of these sections that we've talked about for school construction are just being added one right after the other to the same place in Title 16 in Chapter 123. Here is kind of how the project awards would be reviewed and costs would be determined and eligibility determined. So preliminary application for construction aid would be a school district that's eligible for assistance that intends to construct or purchase a new school or make extensive additions or alterations to its existing school and wants to make itself available of state aid, would submit a preliminary application to the secretary. And then I'm on page 37 now. And the agency would decide by rule what would need to be included in the application. And then the approval of the preliminary application process would be the secretary considering the following things: regional educational opportunities and needs, including school building capacities across school district boundaries and available infrastructure in neighboring communities, economic efficiencies, the suitability of existing school building to continue to meet educational needs and statewide educational initiatives. And then the secretary may approve a preliminary application if the project or part of the project fulfills a need occasioned by conditions that threaten the health or safety of students or employees, facilities that are inadequate to provide programs required by state or federal law or regulations, excessive energy use resulting from the design of a building or reliance on fossil fuels or electric space or heat, or deterioration of an existing building, or project results in consolidation of 2 or more school buildings and will serve the educational needs of students in a more cost-effective and educationally appropriate manner as compared to individual projects constructed separately. The needs addressed by the project cannot reasonably be met by another means. The project type, kind, quality, size, and estimated cost of the project are suitable for the proposed curriculum and meet all legal standards. The applicant achieves the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards regarding facilities management adopted by rule of the agency. And the applicant has completed a facilities master planning process that engages robust community involvement, considers regional solutions, evaluates environmental contaminants, and produces a facilities master plan that unites the applicant's vision statement, educational needs, enrollment projections, renovation needs, and construction projects. A lot of this is already in current law. Page 39, priorities. So after the secretary has reviewed a preliminary application and provided that the district has voted funds or authorized a bond for the total estimated cost of the project, so the district has to have secured funding first, with the advice for the State Aid of School Construction Advisory Board, the secretary would assign points to the project as prescribed by rule by the agency, so that the project can be placed on a priority list on the number of points received. The thought being that at any given time, there may be more need than there are funds available. And all of those priorities would be worked out in rule. Request for legislative appropriation. The agency shall submit its annual school construction refunding request to the governor as part of its budget proposal. And then following submission of the governor's recommended budget to the General Assembly, House Committee on Education and Senate Committee on Education shall recommend total school construction appropriation for the next fiscal year to the General Assembly. Final approval for construction aid. Unless approved by the secretary for good cause in advance of commencement of construction, a school district shall not begin construction before the secretary approves a final application. A school district may submit a written final application at any time following approval of a preliminary application. And the secretary may approve a final application for a project provided that, I'm on page 40, the project was approved preliminarily already. The district has voted funds or authorized a bond for the total estimated cost of the project. The district has made arrangements for project construction supervisions by persons competent in the building trades. The district has provided for construction financing of the project during a period prescribed by the agency. The project has otherwise met requirements of this chapter. And if the pros per project includes a playground, the project includes a requirement that the design and construction of the playground equipment follow the guidelines set forth by the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission Handbook for Public Playground Safety. And if the total estimated cost of the proposed project is less than $50,000, no performance bond or irrevocable letter of credit shall be required. And the secretary may provide that a grant for a high school project is conditioned upon the agreement that of the recipient to provide high school instruction for any high school pupil living in an area prescribed by the agency who may elect to attend the school. I'm on page 41. A district may begin construction upon receipt of final approval. However, a district shall not be reimbursed for debt incurred due to borrowing of funds in anticipation of aid under this section. And then what is the actual aid to be awarded? The base amount of an award shall be 20% of the eligible debt service cost of a project. Projects are eligible for additional bonus incentives as specified in rule for up to an additional 20% of the eligible debt service cost. As used in this subdivision, eligible debt service cost of a project means the product of the lifetime cost of the bond authorized for the project and the ratio of the approved cost of a project to the total cost of the project. And then notwithstanding any other provision of this section, the secretary may grant aid for a project that the secretary deems to be an emergency in the amount of 30% of eligible project costs, up to a maximum eligible total project cost of $300,000, which I believe would be a net of a total of $90,000. So 30% of $300,000 would be $90,000. And that is that section. And I see a hand.
Yes, Representative Zazik.
Thank you, Beth. So first, I'm just going to summarize what I think I heard and then ask a clarifying question. So the secretary would grant preliminary approval based on a set of criteria. Then based on those who get preliminary approval would be weighted, for lack of a better term, to get points based on prioritization of those different factors. Agency would aggregate those, ask to put it in the GOVS recommend, and then the GOVS recommend comes to the General Assembly. Will the legislature have access to or be reported to with that full list of prioritizations and that full list of projects, regardless of whether the governor decides to include them in his recommendation? Because I could imagine any governor, any executive saying, hey, we have $60 million in need. We can only afford 20 million this year, so I'm going to send 20 million to the legislature. But I think the legislature should be aware of the full cost of all the need.
I may get back to you on this. I have not been the point person on this language, so this may be in here somewhere, and because I am not dreaming about it every night, it may just not be coming to top of my mind. But I'm not seeing a requirement that there be a list to you all of what they have, like the list of applications they've received and their priority list, et cetera. But I will review it further and confirm that, but I haven't seen that language yet.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then just for the record, I would like to see that language included as we move forward.
Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Representative Canfield. Beth, on page 40, section C, the secretary may provide that a grant for a high school project is conditioned upon the agreement of the recipient to provide high school instruction for any high school pupil living in an area prescribed by the agency who may elect to attend the school. Was there any discussion of how that plays into the expansion of school choice, essentially, over time? That's one concern I have about that language. The other concern is just having been through a process of trying to size appropriately a school project. I mean, I guess the agency would take it into account, but it's very tricky to sort of open up a school that's sized in a way that's meant to provide education for students in a very specific area to a wider group of people, assuming that there might be a lot of interest in, attending the latest, greatest high school. Was there any discussion or concern about that in the education committee when they reviewed this language?
So I will admit, because I was not the lead drafter on this language, I was not in committee for every conversation that they've had. So I think John and I are going to be a joint package for you all this week.
Okay.
And if I'm unable to answer your question today, I will certainly loop back around with John and get an answer for whether there was discussion on that. But I think policies for a future state haven't been ironed out. They haven't been discussed yet.
Okay.
So I think are you talking kind of like a magnet school and what that would do?
Yeah. I mean, essentially, to me, that language reads that the secretary could turn any of these regional high schools into magnet schools, basically. And that was a little bit concerning to me.
So I don't know if this will allay your fears, but on page 40, line 16, subdivision C is current law. It's new law because we're redoing the chapter, but that language already appears in law and has remained unchanged for decades. But I hear you on your fears for going into a future state, and I don't know how this language would be used in a future state.
Well, and we haven't, it may have been law for decades, but we haven't had a school construction fund for a very long time. For over a decade. Can I ask one other small question? Again, this might be one for John. Is the next page, section D, maybe I missed it and I might need to just reread the language again, but I was trying to figure out how districts are supposed to pay for all the pre-approval work that goes into this, because section D says that a district should not be reimbursed for debt incurred due to borrowing of funds in anticipation of aid under this section. And the pre-approval work can be quite extensive. It can, range in the hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're talking about a very big project. And I just might have missed it somewhere, but I wasn't quite understanding how that was supposed to be paid for.
John's going to regret doing this, but he just let me know he's in the Zoom.
Okay.
Hey, John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So this is much like the last provision that you were citing. This is an existing law, so this is just mirroring that existing provision. But I do think it's a good question to ask how that kind of ground laying work is handled.
And who would I ask that question to? Like, what's the appropriate venue for that?
So I think the Agency of Education may have some sense for years ago how these provisions were dealt with, but obviously this has been under moratorium for a long, long time. And the reasons for which the program functioned years ago are, I think, different than are envisioned going forward under this program, because if you read the language in existing law, it's addressing a lot of emergency type provisions and explicitly calls out that deferred projects that stem from deferred maintenance are not permissible uses. And so you can just see that the scope of the project years ago, or the program years ago, is different than what's envisioned here. But I think that's a good question.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Rep. Canfield. And I just wanted to say, Representative Burkhart, everybody supports school construction funding now because the Ed Fund is self-equalizing. I really appreciate the work here to try to make it a little bit more focused and disciplined. But it is true that this program was suspended in 2007. And I've looked through this bill, including at the end, and I didn't see any staffing recommended for the agency. And I could understand if the agency doesn't lose federal funding, that it could conceivably do some of the school quality work. But there is nobody at the agency right now, no FTE dedicated to school construction. So I just wondered if the committee had discussed agency capacity at all, because I would be very, very concerned about this, given the sheer volume of committees and work implied, if there wasn't capacity being provided.
Yes. I have two pieces of information for you on that. One is that later on in the bill, there is a request to have the agency report back to the General Assembly with their plan for staffing a school construction department. So job descriptions, roles, etc. So they have to come back to you with that plan. And then the agency testified in House Education that they are, oh boy, I will find their testimony. It was written and I will send it to Sorsha to send out to you all. But I can't remember if it was a position that they are currently hiring for or a position that they will hire for, depending on what you all grant them in the budget this year. And one of those positions would be totally dedicated to school construction.
I think I saw that. That was the testimony she provided for 5 positions for.
Yes, yes, yep.
Okay.
Representative Kimball.
Thank you, Representative Canfield. I think to Representative Wazizak's question about the list, on the top of page 30, I believe, Beth, is where it's maintaining the agency is responsible for maintaining a current list of school construction projects that have received preliminary approval, projects that have been final approval, and priority projects. And then the next one, numbered 7 and 8, collecting, maintaining, and making publicly available quarterly progress reports. So it looks like that might be at least having that information available.
They certainly have to maintain that, but I agree that I don't see language in here that is an explicit, and then on January 15th of each year,
Make
you
it
need to give
available
it to
for
the
us.
General Assembly.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead. That was John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree. The GovRec language just requires a submission of the funding request, but doesn't explicitly call out a list of prioritized projects.
Okay. I guess the question that I had too is on timing. If the state aid for school construction advisory boards created on July 1st, they have to meet by January 1st, so the recommendations by July 1st, and that's when the fund is created. So if somebody wants to build a new school today, let's say in the central part of the state, and they really want to have state aid for school construction, what are we looking at in terms of a timeline? What are the thoughts on that?
John, correct me if I'm wrong. I think the holdup is the state funding source.
That's right. And I would note that in committee discussion about trying to address pre-existing projects so that you don't deter people from pursuing projects that you might want to have and came up, but there was never a resolution as to how to address the incentives of setting up a new system. So I do think we're just waiting on what the funding will be.
Okay, excuse me. You can create all the skeleton, but not put any meat on it until you actually have money.
Yeah, exactly. And another way to think about it is that the current system, this doesn't disrupt yet the way the current system works, which is through bonding that goes into your education spending and the like. So that's the current provision for dealing with school construction. And until a fulsome system is set up, that's the world that folks are living in.
And this does not prohibit a school from pursuing new construction prior to all of these new prioritizations either.
Not at all.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Beth, where are we at?
All right. Oh boy, now I have to avert your eyes. I'm going to do some scrolling here. Huge thank you to John for jumping in. I think we are on page 41, line 17, section 15. Again, this section would take effect on July 1, 2026. And it is just saying it is substantially similar to current law, saying that if you are aggrieved by a decision or an order, an allocation of money by the Agency of Education, you could appeal to the Superior Court. Page 42, section 16, line 1 is transfer of rulemaking authority. Currently, the State Board of Education holds these rules. And this is standard language that would transfer not only authority to adopt rules, but actually transfer the rules themselves to the Agency of Education. And that would take effect on July 1, 2026. And then section 17 is our last school construction related section. Line 15, again, taking effect on July 1, 2026, is the repeal of 2 sections of current law that are essentially the school construction program, the body of the school construction program current law. And so we would just be repealing those and replacing it with everything we just walked through. And then there are a whole host of other pieces of current law that has not been touched by this language that would live in the same chapter. And that ends school construction conveniently on the hour if you were interested in taking a break.
Committee, what are your thoughts?
Yes.
Odie,
Yeah, I
you're
think
always
we
first.
should take a break.
Okay,
yeah.